What open source has done is it has democratized a lot of technologies where people can very easily, use them. But open source is still day one problem. For day two, you still need somebody who knows, or you have to have teams. That is the problem that cloud solved. You don't even have to worry about day two. You just go to the cloud, of course, if you're not managing yourself, and you can start consuming it. But that is also affecting open source licensing a bit. We have seen a lot of companies, they are trying to keep up, and they are trying to find solution for that problem that cloud is kind of creating in licensing. Because with cloud, if you look at SFS, you don't have to redistribute any code, so you are not obligated like that. So we have seen a lot of companies, they are changing their licenses, which, depending on how you look at the discussion, may even say that, hey, that code is no longer open source now because it's not OSI compliant or whatever it is. So how, like Elasticsearch is a very good example recently. MongoDB, earlier we saw that. Other companies have also done that. So how does that affect any lines? Because you are contributing to a lot of open source technology. You work in an open source space.
That's a very good question that kept us busy in the past years, talking to clients a lot. In fact, MongoDB was one of the first companies who changed from an open source license to a license that they call the server-side license, the SSPL. I think they try to get it accredited or confirmed that it is an open source license. It created a huge discussions with high emotions that were not very positive about that move. So they've drawn back that proposal to get that SSPL branded as a open source license. These companies, they then, let's say there are two sides of the discussion. The one perspective on this is there are companies who invest a lot of money into building open source, sharing their software with a community of people who can volunteer, contribute to the software, make changes, apply the software to their own organizations without being paid for, without having to pay for it. So there are no license fees. You can just download open source software, change it, use it. And people love that. There's a kind of love story over the last years with open source. And that's wonderful. And I really, truly love that. And we are leveraging open source since our company exists. Now, there's also an observation, and that observation is that it is not all happy and joyful in the open source world, but there are legitimate interests of vendors to protect their own businesses. Let's say they've onboarded funding from investors who usually have a particular time frame to get their money back. So they have, let's say, a time frame in which they have to get, profits or revenue back. And then cloud providers of various sizes, let's say large ones, maybe the ones that caused that shift in thinking, they just took these services and offered them on their platforms without contributing back to the original vendors. Now, there's business interests involved, so there's money to be made. And, let's say there are moral aspects to that story, but there are also, let's say, monetary interests to be respected. So these discussions often have a kind of moral, subtle or moral subtone to them. But it is also about the money behind the scenes. And that makes sense. So these vendors say, we contribute and we invest in software. We need to make money to fund all that software development. And we would like to protect a certain part of our business. In the SSPL, MongoDB, for example, has decided to own the managed offering towards a public crowd. So if you are a public platform, and you want to offer MongoDB as a service to third-party developers, you'd have to purchase a license. And that is, well, let's say, restricting the freedom on how to use a software that was up to this point open source. Now, one could say MongoDB is a particular case because they have been using the HEPL with a strong copyleft from early days. They've always said, we want the HEPL to interpret it in a way that it still, leaves it in a way that they can protect their own interests. So that's kind of one thing. Now, with Elasticsearch, a second vendor has gone this route and tries to, or changes from an open source license to that dual license model. And for their open source license, Elasticsearch was using Apache 2. So the Apache 2 license is a rather, it doesn't have a strong copyleft. It doesn't have a copyleft at all. I don't think so. And it's rather liberal. And for example, for me, this is even a stronger change, because from a project that has committed to Apache 2 once, change back their open source part into SSPL is introducing a abrupt disruption for certain customers. And we have seen customers in our customer base being affected by that too. And to in their perspective, without having my own position here, but in their perspective, they were in a transition to adapt open source in large organizations. That's not easy to achieve, right? They slowly build trust into open source projects, and then they suddenly see faced with the necessity to negotiate with a vendor, because otherwise they'd be violating a new software, which at some point, I don't think it's blackmail, but at least I heard that word in conversations. People felt blackmailed to talk to these vendors. And that's not a very good way to start a conversation, I suppose. So I'm not really sure which side is now better. The ones who want to protect the investment, still do a lot in open source, and just feel as if they protect their legitimate business interests against others who do not want to contribute back to the community? Or are there companies who have used the advantage of open source for their marketing purposes, collecting a critical mass of users to then monetize hard on these users by pushing their own commercial products? As I said, I don't have a final opinion about this. All I can say is that the controversial nature of these discussions show that it's at least not as easy to say which one of the different perspectives is right. There's legitimate interest and criticism, I think, on both sides of that discussion. For Any9's customers, we inform our clients when they engage with, for example, the Any9's data services, and tell them that there are services being shipped with SSPL licenses, and that they need to check with their own lawyers whether they want to offer that to their developers. And basically, do they have third-party developers or not, is usually the question to be answered, which is most of the cases rather simple. And most of our clients don't have that problem and therefore aren't affected by that license change. But still, it's a hot topic to discuss. And so there are different perspectives with legitimate arguments, I would assume. By the way, our own products, our own automation, that is more like the gluing open source software together. We've never open sourced a large swath of our own frameworks because we also saw problems in releasing the software and protecting our commercial interests. And we had a model to the proprietary part of Elasticsearch and Elastic products, where we share the source code with our clients, where they can sign contributors agreements so that they can openly look at the software. But we keep the intellectual property And it's not an open source license because we are self-funded. We don't have investors, and therefore we also need to protect our money streams that fund the developers who will then take care of the product. So I would say developing an open source product is something that people may do from different motivations, but having a solid runway to establish a technology, push it into the market, and then find a way to monetize it is something you really need to have patience and the corresponding runway organized. So otherwise, you may run out of luck at some point.